May 1945, in the fogs of the British suburbs, among fields and woods, giant parking lots stretch to the horizon. Tens of thousands of American trucks are lined up in impossibly smooth squares under the open sky, as if under the watchful gaze of clouds. Their olive-gray camouflage, like the peeling scales of an ancient fish, already bears the marks of time, rust spots, scratches, traces of past battles and dust roads. These are not the children of British factories. Detroit's handwriting clearly speaks to the sharp, hard lines of the bodies, rounded Chevrolet hoods, rectilinear Ford radiator grills, resilient GMC frames and heavy Studebaker hearts. The American financial giant gave Britain its iron offspring. More than 480,000 trucks and tractors sailed across the Atlantic under the star-spangled banner of the Lend-Lease program, the bulk of which settled on British soil. Europe is free today. A white flag is raised over Germany. The Japanese surrender is a matter of weeks. But these monstrous columns of cars suddenly turn from weapons of victory into a puzzle for both bureaucrats and economists. The gigantic army of technology belongs to the United States. Britain fed, repaired and quickly wore it out on roads from the Libyan sands to the Flemish plains, but never became the true owner. Peaceful spring brings uncomfortable questions. What should we do now with these 500,000 other people's cars sprawled across the island and the entire continent? Buy? Send it across the ocean? Write off the engines past the scrap metal and burn it? The answers to these questions, cold and cruel, revealed the true depth of the financial abyss beneath Britain's feet. It was in the post-war gloom that the inescapable dependence of British troops on the American auto empire was exposed. Between 1941 and 1945, port cranes unloaded 427,284 trucks for Britain, and over 50,000 more went to reinforce imperial troops in India, South Africa, and Australia. The statistics are pitiless. The native car industry pales next to this wave. On British roads, Dodge trucks, 2-ton GMCs, heavy Diamond T 4-ton trucks and white 6-ton trucks, helpful Chevrolet 1500 pickups, hospital, sanitary, vans, workshops on wheels, radio locomotives with antennas reaching for the gloomy sky rattle with a variety of engines. All these iron giants formed the backbone of British military logistics. By May 1945, 60% of the British Army's fleet consisted of American vehicles. In the fields of Italy, the 8th Army lives thanks to the Americans, almost without exception. In Germany, the Army of the Second Front has an American auto trio for every British piece of equipment. Even at home, according to the data, about 180,000 Yankee trucks crowd parking lots and hangars, and another 120,000 live out their days in France, Belgium, and defeated Germany. Calabria district to Palestine, from the Indus to Burma, the geography of this auto expansion is vast, like oceans crossed by convoys. Each truck has its own individual story. Some still smell like factory paint, and their odometer hasn't even reached 5,000 miles. Others, scorched by the North African sun and suffocating in dried-up bearings, have long exceeded 80,000 miles and are groaning under the weight of wear. The first and main challenge of May 1945 consists of political and financial anguish. The Lend-Lease law is as clear as a hammer blow. Weapons are only loaned, but not donated. The end of the war entails a tough choice. The United States demands the return of suitable equipment, or its purchase at a residual, but still astronomical price. The American officials, who arrived as soon as the victory salutes stopped, look like vultures of the financial field. The Lend-Lease Liquidation Commission, specially created for the global settlement of these warehouse skyscrapers, bites into evacuation fleets, evaluates every iron heart. The first rounds of negotiations sound like a death knell for the British: either return the cars or pay. For each serviceable one, £400, for an average condition, £250, and for a tired old timer even as much as £100. Test the arithmetic: 500,000 cars. The geometry of expenses grows into a nightmare. Exhausted by the 6-year meat grinder, the country, which is on the verge of bankruptcy, cannot afford the mass purchase of trucks that have long become indispensable. British diplomats and treasurers, shaken by the impending financial disaster, are frantically clinging to any opportunity to renegotiate the terms of the deal. The American side is in no hurry to show leniency. In their eyes, there are thousands of trucks, still in shape, capable of competing with the products of Detroit's auto giants in the coming era of a peaceful industry. Their concern is not only about the budget. The return, or better yet, the destruction of these vehicles will ensure stable demand for the new car market in the future. Military trucks filling Europe can bring down prices and slow down the start of factories. As summer ends with long rainy days, American and British officials hide behind negotiating tables, and an army of trucks slowly rust away, eating up security shifts on duty and losing the last of their vitality under the unbearable dampness. With every passing day, the situation for the UK is becoming critical. Foreign exchange reserves are running out, every dollar is needed to buy bread and raw materials, and huge expenses for the transportation of other people's cars seem like an impossible luxury. But the lingering need for vehicles puts pressure on the state. Without the usual Yankee wheels, it is impossible to start a war-torn economy. The American position is also fraught with contradictions. Congress demands the return of costs and the protection of the domestic market, but does not deny the reality of British difficulties. On one of the last days of August 1945, out of the blue, the Truman administration announced the immediate curtailment of Lend-Lease. Since August 21, deliveries have been stopped. Cargo liners are still moving by inertia, but the supply line is snapping forever. The pressure on British finances is growing many times over, because now the question of the fate of the equipment that has already arrived is becoming paramount. The British are intensifying negotiations. Representatives of the Ministry of Supply and the Military Department put forward a compromise proposal, not to buy the cars piece by piece, but to close the issue with the total amount for the entire volume of Lend-Lease, retaining only the necessary copies. Logic won out. In December 1945, the Anglo-American financial agreement fixed the amount at £650 million. Britain pays about a tenth of the original cost of all stored equipment, a high price, but no longer destructive. The transaction distinguishes between two categories: what will have to be paid immediately, for civilian ministries, and what will be transferred to the military balance in installments as part of a general loan. A gigantic inventory begins. The Ministry of Supply is building support camps in Chilwell, Dunnington, Bicester, and other places. Engines are humming in the hangars and tired mechanics are swearing. The winter of 1945-46 is dripping fuel oil down their sleeves while they check the condition of each car. The accountants sorted out, about 125,000 remain in service. The most recent, unreliable, rare to replace or extremely necessary for the occupation contingent in Germany. Another 95,000 are being sent to the needs of civilian ministries. Road workers will receive their rough laborers to repair highways, foresters, to export logs. Municipalities across the country are pumping out American vehicles for garbage routes, firefighters and other rapid response teams. Germany is a particular headache. There are 78,000 more American trucks serving here as part of the British Army of the Rhine. The occupation requires a powerful motor artery, but it is becoming increasingly difficult to maintain these foreign cars. Mechanical parts are disappearing like snow in the sun, American warehouses are emptying, and every broken truck becomes a heavy dead weight. The strategy is changing. It was decided to leave only 45,000 relatively new GMCs and Studebakers in the Army of the Rhine, and to write off the older, veterans. It is unprofitable to return them to the island. The shipping cost will exceed the market price of the junk. Instead, Germany is starting to sell other people's hardware on a massive scale. the German Control Commission organizes sales points in Hamburg, Hanover, and the Ruhr. German transport companies, like hungry animals, rush to cheap ones, but they need Chevrolet, Dodge, and Ford workers. They need cars to revive the remnants of a destroyed economy. Market prices are staggering, usually from £50 to £150, depending on the condition. By the fall of 1946, about 22,000 American trucks, once delivered under Lend-Lease, had changed from military uniforms to civilian clothes. They were driving along German roads, smelling of cheap fuel fumes, but serving the cause of the New World. They have become a familiar feature of German highways, dressed in fresh paint, decorated with brand new German license plates. These hardy trucks silently participated in the revival of the country, like hard workers who do not know fatigue. Here, in the shadow of creaking telephone lines, the Commonwealth negotiations dragged on. Throughout 1946, this administrative chess match lasted, where hundreds of thousands of cars acted as pawns. Canada, which inherited 237,000 American cars from Lend-Lease lists, faced the same difficulties as others. 44,000 steel giants from overseas joined the Australian fleet, and both dominions negotiated similar terms with the United States, paying a reduced price for the transport remaining at their disposal. The United Kingdom, which suffered from a post-war deficit, offered part of its share to the Commonwealth countries, those who needed additional capacity from the nose. New Zealand, full of ambition and long-range routes, bought 3,400 American trucks from the British. South Africa, just over 2,000. In India, where the lack of transport threatened to turn into a disaster, a new flow broke out. 8,500 vehicles were loaned from British military depots in the Middle East. The Soviet story of Lend-Lease is intertwined in this tangle of contrasts. The USSR received about 427,000 American trucks, almost as many as the British, but the Soviet way was special: to keep everything, not to return a penny. When the U.S. representatives asked for reports on the surviving vehicles and the return of the surplus, the East responded only with formal lists. Most of the cars that survived to the end of the war remained in the USSR, benefiting the Soviet lands until the 50s. Some U.S. 6 Studebakers, the gunners' favorites, served until the very breath of the 60s. The Soviets' unwillingness to keep honest Lend-Lease records was one of the first thorns in the body of the impending Cold War. Britain, although it was on the verge of bankruptcy, fulfilled the agreement with a creaking heart. The difference in approaches only highlighted the new fault lines of the former alliance. If the depths of these post-war logistical waters capture you, linger here, there will be more. In Britain, meanwhile, the disposal of American vehicles that were not needed by the army was on the rise. The hangars were raked with frenzied inevitability in 1946 and 1947. Approximately 185,000 steel giants were considered unprofitable for further maintenance. They had their own fork in the road, depending on their condition and geography. Those who got the roads, those who had good engines, had auctions. The Ministry of Supply organized devastating sales in dozens of British warehouses. Private cargo carriers, still recovering from the war, were raking in thousands of Chevrolet and Ford trucks, as if collecting bones for future business. Farmers bought four-wheeled Dodges for draft needs. Construction companies were eyeing the mighty diamonds and whites as masts of new urban forests. Prices were dancing. £180 for a serviceable 2.5 GMC, a measly 8 for a battered Chevrolet. For the Treasury, this turned out to be 18 million, not a stream, but a significant breath of freshness in the tightened belt of the economy. More worn-out cars were being sold for scrap, as if paying off the last debt to the country. In conditions of a shortage of steel, scrap became gold. Merchants bought broken Americans for £15 to £30 each, and put them under the cutter in Birmingham or Sheffield yards. By 1948, approximately 67,000 Leningrad cars were already throwing sparks and dust, going into the melting down their nerves of steel strengthened the new houses of Britain. Where the costs of evacuation exceeded the benefits, the cars were left to die, in the remote corners of Scotland and Northern Ireland, among blackberry thickets and peeling hangars. Clusters of American trucks slowly dissolved in time. There was no one to pull them to the landfills, and in the 1950s these huge skeletons, wrapped in weeds, disappeared into the ground. Some survived before they were finally removed. In the Mediterranean, where the roadmap of the war has long been covered with sand, there were enough problems of their own. Over 60,000 American vehicles were stuck in Egypt, Palestine, Libya, and Italy by the middle of 1945. When the British withdrew their troops, these steel relics became redundant. The Middle East Command set up delivery points in Cairo and Alexandria. Thousands of vehicles found new owners among Egyptian contractors and transport workers. The strange moment when the last soldiers left Palestine in 1948 was marked by a line in the inventory: 8,000 American trucks abandoned on the roads, some of which dispersed between Israeli and Arab forces. In the Libyan deserts, the echo of the fighting hid hundreds of wrecked vehicles among the dunes, now lost in the sandy time. Meanwhile, a new stream was rolling along British roads, the huge silhouettes of Chevrolet and GMC, familiar as a new breath of the landscape. Firefighters from villages turned Dodges into red wagons, foresters relied on the indomitable four-wheel drive power wagon. Small businesses were born around inexpensive American cars, which became a bastion of new entrepreneurship. Simplicity and strength were what set them apart from their British counterparts. They were easy to repair, and the necessary parts could still be obtained from skilled merchants who collected treasures from broken bodies. Their powerful engines, ready to conquer any roads, easily coped with overloads, in the order of the world, where you had to carry an extra bag of cement or a box of potatoes. But greed for gasoline became a heavy yoke. Engines born in the era of cheap fuel consumed it like a drunken fire. When gasoline had to be issued by card, such voracious hardware became a burden, and by 1950 most private owners had exchanged their American trucks for fuel-efficient British ones. The military faced other problems. Through 1946 and 47, the War Department kept about 125,000 American vehicles in service. Every year it became more and more difficult to service them. There were not enough spare parts. Because by the end of the 40s, the United States had long stopped producing components for military models. The masters of military garages began to take parts from some cars in order to save others. Engineers made surrogates from what came to hand. By 1949, the fleet of American vehicles in the Army had decreased to 73,000. A new large-scale reduction took place in 1950-51, as the ministry sought to switch to fully British models. The outbreak of the Korean War briefly delayed the departure of the heavy Lend-Lease monsters, especially the scarce tractors. But by 1953, there were only 28,000 American vehicles left in the British Army, mostly specializing in individual tasks, or working at foreign bases where parts could still be found. This story received an unexpected continuation in museum halls and in private courtyards. Hundreds, or rather, only crumbs of the original number, survived their era not by the will of someone's strategies, but thanks to the stubbornness of small enterprises, communal workshops, farms, where people who mastered complex technology were located. Only from time to time did such machines end up in museum collections, not being of particular interest to memory keepers at that time. It was only by the 1960s that individual exhibits penetrated the collections. For example, the Imperial War Museum acquired the GMC CCKW in 1967, a car that reached the Rhine and survived the battles of northwestern Europe. The National Automobile Museum in Beaulieu acquired the Dodge WC. And the Bovington Tank Museum preserved the rarest diamond tank transporter. In the 70s, the hobby of preserving military equipment gained momentum. Private traders began to assemble American military vehicles, pulling rare specimens from sheds, landfills, and warehouses. In Scotland, for example, in 1982, the Studebaker US-6 was dug up and started, which had gone through a long journey of logging. In remote areas, there were whole ghosts of car parks. They were restored, turned into national relics. There are about 85 Lend-Lease trucks of various models in the current British collections of military equipment, and this is less than a tiny fraction of the former Armada. The Wiltshire Society of Military Equipment parades restored GMCs and Dodges. Amateurs from all over the country own about 200 more cars, most often Dodge WC and Jeep, although Jeeps were a separate category of supplies. Continental Europe is also opening its memory closets. German museums carefully preserve American trucks that came into their possession in the post-war years, when the Lend-Lease engine was dying down, but its echoes echoed in every rusty part. In the Netherlands, not far from the serene green plains, the Overend War Museum preserves a GMC veteran, torn from the grip of a local transportation company, like a relic from the sands of time. And a little further south, in the German city of Zins, the Auto and Technik Museum carefully exhibits an entire Ford G8T. It once served under the British flag before its wheels spun on the peaceful roads of Germany. But the legacy of Lend-Lease trucks is not limited to the steel of their bodies. This experience invisibly penetrated into the very fabric of post-war British engineering. British designers eagerly explored the methods of the Americans. Their admiration for American simplicity and uniformity grew against the background of memories of infinitely incompatible and whimsical domestic trucks that tormented military convoys. Where the Americans had every nut matched, the British were faced with a chaos of details and standards. When developing legendary models of the 1950s, such as the Bedford RL, the influence of overseas colleagues manifested itself. In the hands of engineers, machines with simplified care and unified elements were born, as if an industrial evolutionary step had been taken under someone else's hardened shadow. The financial resolution of the Lend-Lease epic left deep political scars. The uncompromising lesson of dependence on foreign supplies burned not only Westminster officials, but also echoed through future cabinets. Negotiations on the right to keep trucks, when the country was on the verge of default, proved to be a bitter lesson for many generations to come. All the simple truths were crossed out by one. The production of key equipment should not be sent abroad, even if domestic factories require large amounts of money. Otherwise, vulnerability will sooner or later enter the door. And yet it's not the quantity that really amazes, but the speed with which the whole machine world has disappeared. In a matter of years after the thunderous end of the war, almost 500,000 trucks evaporated from Britain's seething transport pools. Some disappeared at auctions, others became rusty cargo in landfills, and others disappeared without a trace. After 5 years, the surviving copies already looked like a curiosity. A decade had passed, and only a few remained on the move, like stubborn old men in a market where everything had been young for a long time. 20 years later, only fanatics began to look for them, which turned out to be a circle that had experienced both rise and oblivion. This fleeting cycle became the rule for military equipment during the Cold War, when grandiose investments disappeared instantly after losing relevance, giving way to new projects, new eras. The history of British Lend-Lease trucks rarely becomes an ornament to triumphant chronicles, but it exposes the skeleton of logistics, the invisible enemy of the world, without which any laurels of victory quickly turn into dust. After the fireworks in May of the 45th, years of dull work began, endless accounting, disagreements over payments with the Americans, the crackle of typewriters turning the chessboard of technology into a string of costs and write-offs. The fight for German technological spoils that fueled the headlines was just one side of a peaceful drama. But the fate of hundreds of thousands of ordinary trucks opens up a much more fundamental page. Britain emerged from the troubles with Reeves, but without money, barely able to buy back the tired cars on which its armies rolled the freedom of Europe. The Americans showed generosity, but also firmness. They demanded to return or pay, and the kingdom had to put up with the mass disposal of cars in favor of balance. Years have passed, and the traces of this gigantic mechanical flow have almost been erased by the wind of change. Today, GMC and Studebaker stand silently in British museums, not just machinery, but monuments to the industrial might that fed and supplied armies on 2 continents. Their iron ribs remind us that the material evidence of even the closest history disappears as easily as a draft in hangars. Decisions made for the sake of economy or simplicity can only leave shadows on concrete where the Iron Army rumbled recently. If this story seemed valuable to you, listen to the new muffled voice of history, find out where the German V-2 rockets disappeared to, and how they marked the beginning of an amazing era of space exploration, becoming the foundation for nuclear ambitions and the Cold War.